Okay, so we're looking at chapter 26 on page 129 in the Art Scroll, and we started this last week. We'll continue, and as happens in the Torah, for some reason it happens often. You have another famine in the land of Israel. So we mentioned last week there's a famine in the days of each of the patriarchs, right? You have Abraham, there was a famine. Isaac, right now we're going to read about the famine. And then there's the very famous famine in the time of Jacob, where that's why the brothers had to go and buy and purchase the grain. So there were always famines in Israel, at least once in a generation. It's like a stock market crash. There always has to be one in your lifetime, at least one, maybe more. But in any case, so now it becomes very interesting, because what happens is we have Isaac doing, what do you do when there's a famine? Well, everybody has their family history and everyone has their family tradition. And if you want to see what Isaac does, as we mentioned last week, he does really what his father tried to do. And it's interesting to see the similarities and also the distinctions, because it's a very similar story. What is the story we remember with Abraham? Just to refresh our memory, Abraham says there's a famine. He gets to Israel, there's a famine. He goes to Egypt. He gets close to Egypt. He realizes that his wife is a beautiful woman, and he's going to Egypt, where the people presumably wouldn't have never seen a woman as beautiful as Sarah. So he tells his wife, let's make a deal. Tell everybody you're my sister, because if not, they're going to kill me. And that's the plan. That's what they do. And what happens is that she's indeed taken to the king, and then God intervenes. He afflicts Pharaoh and his household, whatever that means. And then he's forced to release her, and he gives her a lot of gifts and sends her away from the land, sends her away from Egypt. A similar thing occurs here, but there are certain similarities, but significant differences. So that helps us, that's just sort of an opportunity to look at what has developed over the generation. The first major difference, as we mentioned, is that God comes to Isaac and he says, don't go down to Egypt. Even though your father did, you should not. Instead, he says you have to remain within the boundaries of the land. But there's a famine, so what do you do? Okay, so he goes to the south of Israel on the coast, next to where the Gaza Strip is today, and he says that's the kingdom of Gerar. That's where the Philistines are. He says you should stay in this land. So Isaac therefore goes not to Egypt, but to the king of the city of Gerar, where the ruler is Abimelech. And there, a similar story happens. He says about his wife, she is my sister. Now there she was not taken to the king or by anybody else. She wasn't abducted the way Sarah was. But the king got very upset, because later the king sees, after a while, the king sees that he is, the verse is mitzachek. He's, in modern Hebrew, mitzchok is to laugh. He's rejoicing, he's happy. He understood that they're treating each other as husband and wife. And then he gets very upset and he says, why have you told me that she is your sister? The king almost took her, and there would have been a sin. And Isaac defends himself. He says, look, I thought they're going to kill me for my wife. And so in that sense, it's similar. And the end of the story is that unlike Pharaoh, who sends away Abraham and Sarah, Isaac is invited by the king to remain in that area, and Isaac becomes very successful until the people get jealous, and that's where he's sent away. So that's the story. We want to look at some of the details. I'm just going to read a few verses, and then we'll see what happens. Right. So I'm reading chapter 26, verse 1, page 129 in the Art Scroll. There was a famine in the land, aside from the first famine that had been in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, to Gerar. In other words, he's going to Gerar, but we understand that he's actually going to Egypt. The way you travel on the coast. So you want to travel to Egypt, you travel on the coast. The easiest way. When the Jewish people came from Egypt back to Israel, they didn't go on the coast, but there the Torah says that God specifically took them the long and roundabout way. The easiest way would be to go right past the Philistines. And when the Jews left Egypt, God said, don't go don't go through the easiest way because the Philistines are there. Maybe the Jews will be afraid of the Philistines. So when he says he's going to the Philistines, he's really going to Egypt. How do we know that? Look at verse 2. And the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land that I will tell you. Sojourn in the land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and your seed I will give these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. And I will multiply your seed like the stars of the heavens, and I will give your seed all these lands. And all the nations of the earth will bless themselves by your seed, because Abraham hearkened to my voice, he kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my instructions. And Isaac dwelt in Gerar. So that's it. But before we get to what happened, that already is a chunk. God comes to him at night. God comes to him and he says, don't go to Egypt, dwell in this land. And he says, I'm going to make the promise with you.
Was he already on the way?
Presumably, yes, because it says he went. Look, verse 1. Verse 1 says there was a famine. So Isaac went to Abimelech. In other words, wherever he was living at the time, he actually packed his bags and he traveled. He went to it says he went to Gerar, to Abimelech, the king of Pelishtim, to Gerar, but that wasn't his final destination. If that was his final destination, yeah, Hashem says, don't go to Egypt. In other words, don't do what your father did. So presumably he's traveling and he's in the Gerar, but his intention is to continue. And God says, stop, don't go to Egypt. And indeed he stops and he stays there for a long time. And God says, no, stay here. Okay, so this begs the question, which we raised last week. Number one, why the difference? How come Abraham goes to Egypt and God does not intervene? God does not tell him not to go to Egypt. With Isaac, God says, remain in the land of Israel. So the classic interpretation that I heard when I was growing up, classic interpretation was that Isaac is considered holy because he was raised on the altar. He was placed on the altar with the binding of Isaac. And just like the holy sacrifices, every holy sacrifice has a boundary of holy space where it cannot leave. Some holy sacrifices must remain in the temple. Some must remain in Jerusalem, right? But holy sacrifices must be in a holy place. So Isaac is considered to be like a holy sacrifice, and therefore he can't leave Israel. Which is why his father never sent him to find Rebekah. He sent a servant. And the servant said, what happens if he doesn't want to come? Should I bring your son there? He says, no, my son can't go there. So it's presumably that's the same reason. Therefore, Isaac cannot leave Israel, not to find a wife and not for the famine. So that's what we heard when we were growing up. Last week, I found a Malbim, a beautiful commentary, a 19th century commentator, who gives two other angles. And last week we mentioned one, and today we'll mention the other. What did we mention last week? He said, last week, what happens here? What happened is a famine. And God says, don't go to Israel, don't go to Egypt. So how is he going to live? There's a famine. The answer is that Isaac is blessed miraculously. And you're going to see it later. It says that he planted and he got 100-fold. Whatever he thought he would make, he would be able to grow because of the famine, he grew 100-fold. So miraculously, God intervenes and blesses his efforts, even though it's a famine, a year of famine. We'll see later how he finds water, but the bottom line is a miracle happens.
He says he's going to do it.
Yeah, he says, I'm going to bless you. He doesn't really define what the blessing is. But if you turn the page and you go to if you turn the page to 131 and you go to verse 12, it says, verse 12, it says, Isaac sowed in that land. And in that year, he reaped 100-fold. That year means the year of the famine. Okay? And thus had Hashem blessed him. So in other words, when it came to Isaac, God says, stay here, I'm going to bless you, it's going to be supernatural. Okay, so why didn't God bless Abraham? Why didn't God give the promise to Abraham? So we mentioned last week that there's a difference. Abraham has to be tested. And therefore, he's not going to get that open miracle. Isaac doesn't have to be tested. That's what the Malbim said. Why not? He says, I thought that was interesting. I'm still trying to process what the Malbim says, the first interpretation. But first thing he says is that Abraham discovers God on his own through intellectual inquiry. And if somebody, when you base your relationship on intellectual inquiry only, then the question becomes, how committed are you? It's an idea, but I have an idea. It doesn't mean I'm committed to that idea. So Abraham is tested, and Abraham has 10 tests specifically to see whether Abraham has faith beyond just intellectual inquiry. He understands that God exists, but will he have faith? So that's what the test is for, to allow Abraham to exercise his faith and to express and strengthen his faith. Whereas Isaac, he was born into the family of Abraham, the legacy of Abraham. He was raised on faith. And you see that with the binding of Isaac, is prepared to give his life to God. So therefore, there's no need or no purpose in testing Isaac, and therefore Isaac gets the blessing, because he doesn't need a test of going down to Egypt. That's the first thing the Malvim said. I said it last week, but you already know it from last week, so I'm going to have to add something. Otherwise, you're going to say, why did I come today? So we'll take Vicky's question, and then we'll give the other interpretation from the Malvim. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, my question is, I'll tell you my question later, but to support Malbim's theory, I guess in verse 5, it says, I'm giving you all those blessings in the merit of your father, right? Yeah. So that's in the merit of your father who already passed the test.
Yeah.
So that's to support that theory.
Yeah. When I was growing up, my grandfather drove, what did he drive? An Oldsmobile. I don't know if they still make Oldsmobiles. And then one day, and now those days, today when I grew up, everyone has fancy cars. But in those days, nobody, there were no leases, nobody had fancy cars. Everyone drove old station wagons. My grandfather, who thank God had a small fortune, drove an Oldsmobile. One day, when I was a little boy, his son buys a Lexus. This is like the most luxurious car like we've ever seen. So my grandfather always used to make jokes. He used to walk around town, and he loved this joke, his favorite joke. And he says, you know why my son drives a Lexus and I drive an Oldsmobile? Because he has a rich father. And that was the joke. So how come Isaac is tested and Abraham is not? Because Isaac has a rich father. In other words, Isaac has a father like Abraham. So if Isaac has a father like Abraham, so Abraham is God already promised to Abraham, because Abraham passed the test. So now his son could drive a Lexus. That's, I think, what Vicky is saying. But
that's what I'm saying. But my question was about Rebecca. He didn't ask Rebecca for her permission to present as his sister. Right?
Yeah, that's part of the problem. We'll get to that later. We didn't read that. That's part of the problem. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the discussion. I'm not saying I have an answer. Don't worry. But at least you're paying attention as to not giving me an easy time, because if you ask me, I would try to skip over that. But you're keeping me honest. Very good. Second thing the Malvim says. The first thing, if you notice, the Malvim says the difference between Abraham and Isaac has to do with Abraham and Isaac, with the people. What the Malvim, the second interpretation of the Malvim, which I think is beautiful, is it has nothing to do with the people, it has to do with the land of Israel. And there's a big shift in the land of Israel between the story of Abraham and the story of Isaac. The land of Israel changes. And because the land of Israel changes, now God says, oh, Israel's a place of miracles. You go there, you rely on the miracles. So don't worry about the famine. You'll survive even in the famine, right? I don't know if this is true or not true, but it's attributed to Ben Gurion, who said in Israel, we don't believe in miracles, we rely on them. In other words, Israel is a place, you have God's miracles, you assume God will intervene. So therefore, in Israel, you say, well, how can I move to Israel? It doesn't look like I'm going to be able to support myself as a famine. Don't worry, God, it's a holy land. God's providence is there. God will perform a miracle. But that, says the Malvim, only happens in Isaac's times, not in Abraham's times. Why not? Because when does Israel become the Holy Land? When does Israel become the land designated for the Jewish people, or not only designated, but given to the Jewish people, and therefore becomes a holy land, and therefore becomes the land of that where you could see God's miracles in the open? So the Malvim argues, and other people say the same thing. They don't say to explain this point, but they say that. But other people make the same point. The Malvim says a very interesting thing. If you turn the pages back, so God, when Abraham is living in Haran, God says, leave your household, leave your birthplace, and go to the land that I will show you. When he gets to the land that I will show you, he gets to Israel, God says, this is the land that I will give you in future tense. In other words, when Abraham first comes to the land, God doesn't say, this is your land. God says, this is the land that I'm going to give you. It's not yours yet. I'm going to give it to you. When does God give it to him? He goes to Egypt. He comes back from Egypt. He has his nephew Lot separates from him. Only after Lot separates from him, then God says, once again promises him the land. And then if you look carefully at the specific expressions that God uses, that the Torah uses, there it says, it sounds like it was given to him at that point. So if you look at page 61 in the Art Scroll, or if you look at the on the screen, hopefully if I can pull it up without taking up too much time, if you look at chapter 13, Genesis chapter 13. So I'm not going to show you on screen, I'm not going to show everything, but so we have the story how they separate. Lot and Abraham separate after he comes back from Egypt. Let me share the screen. I thought I'm sharing it. I'm not. Okay. So if you look at chapter 13, verse.
Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, while Lot dwelt in the city.
Yes. Yeah. So 1 second. I have a little bit of a problem here. I thought I was going to say something else. Okay. I shouldn't have showed you the verses. No, I'm kidding. Let's look at verse 14. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, please raise your eyes and see from the place where you are northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your seed to eternity. And I will make your seed like the dust of the earth, so that if a man will be able to count the dust of the earth, so will your seed be counted. Rise, walk in the land to its length and to its breadth, for I will give it to you. And Abraham pitched his tent, and he came and he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Okay, I thought he's going to say something else. I thought that it's going to say in present tense that it was given to him, but I don't see it here. So I'm going to look at my notes. But what I think what may be happening here is that. Give me just a second. Oh yeah. He says, the Talmud says like this, God makes him the promise. But then verse 17, rise, walk in the land to its length and to its breadth, for I will give it to you. Why does Abraham have to walk the entire land? He's an old man. Abraham is at least 75. You have to literally walk the entire land, length and breadth. So the commentaries explain, the Malbim quotes the Talmud in Bava Batra, there are different ways of acquiring real estate. And just because someone, let's say, gifts you real estate, let's say you decide to gift me your house, there has to be a formal act of acquisition. You have to give me a document. We have to transfer something. There has to be a formal act of acquisition for me to actually acquire the land that you want to gift me. One of the forms of formal acquisition is called chazaka. Chazaka means you take possession. How do you take possession? One of the ways is you actually walk the borders of the land. So God tells Abraham here, when he comes back from Egypt, Lot separated from him. He says, now walk the land, because wherever you're going to walk, you're going to get. I don't know if this is true or not, but I think I read in the book that Pennsylvania, the William Penn got a gift from the king or from the local Indian tribe. He said he gave him some produce. He said, as far as you can walk today, that's how far till sunset. That's how much land I'm going to give you. So he rode a horse and he got more lands. That's what I heard when I was a kid. I don't know if it's true or not. But the bottom line is that's what you did. You want to acquire the land, you have to walk the borders. So here God tells him now, he says, get up, walk around the land because I'm giving it to you. So in other words, beforehand, it was just a promise in the future you're going to get the land. When does Abraham actually take possession of the land? He takes possession of the land when Abraham actually walks the land after he comes back from Egypt. Says the Malbim, okay. One of the reasons why there was no miracle to Abraham, Abraham didn't miraculously grow a lot of food in a year of famine, is because it wasn't a holy land yet. It didn't have the holiness of Israel, so it wasn't worthy to have an open miracle. Only after Abraham takes possession of the land, then you can have the miracle for Isaac. So I just want to point one thing, that ties into another question. Some people say that Lot had to go away from Abraham before he can get the land. Because if you remember, God said, leave your household, leave your family. Some people say the fact that Lot came along, Lot wanted to come along. So Abraham's a nice guy, he's not going to push him away. But some people say Abraham has to be alone. He has to separate from his family completely. That's what some people say. I'm not saying it's the only interpretation. But the bottom line is this. The bottom line is that you see, at least some interpretations, is that he doesn't get the land until he comes back from Egypt. What's the bottom line? What's interesting to me is if you're the Malbim, you offer two interpretations. I ask you a simple question. Why is the famine in times of Isaac different than the famine in times of Abraham? How come Abraham, there's no miracle, he has to go to Egypt, and Isaac, there is a miracle and he gets to stay in the land? So if you notice the two interpretations of the Malbim, the first interpretation attributes it to the people, to the difference in Abraham and Isaac. The second interpretation says it has nothing to do with the people, has to do with the land. Whether the land now became the Holy Land. Once the land becomes the Holy Land, once it's acquired by Abraham, then a miracle can happen. So in the yeshiva, in the philosophy of Jewish law, they always think about something they call gavra and chefza, person or object. So that's it. There's a commandment. The Torah says, I don't know, sabbatical. Don't do the earth has to rest on the seventh year in Israel. We're the seventh year in Israel. The earth has to rest. The question is it a mitzvah on the person? I am not allowed to work the land, but somebody else could, maybe a Gentile could. Or is it a mitzvah on the land that the land has to rest? So there's always that's the way. Oh, so this interpretation, you have two interpretations. One is the people, is the difference that
They were both together.
maybe they're both, maybe both are
He
right.
had to get rid of a bad person,
Yes,
Lot.
Yeah.
And he had to walk the land also.
right.
So he couldn't get
You
rid of
you
Lot
couldn't.
himself, so God said, I'm getting rid of Lot for you, I'm
Right.
gonna get rid of him, and he put it in his mind to go wherever he went.
Right, to separate.
And then Abraham was by himself.
Yeah, I agree. I'm saying it could be both, but I'm just saying it's just that's one of the things you ask anytime you hear about a question
But
or
God was
concept.
also-
Yeah, all I'm trying to say is that you could think about you could look at the person when you have a question. You have two stories and something changed, and what changed? So you can think about, did people change or did the physical circumstances change? Right?
Okay.
Sometimes they both change. I'm just saying this is how you look at this is how the commentary. I'm trying to give you the tools to be a commentator, right? Even if you are a storyteller, right? In every story, something has to develop. So what develops? Sometimes the character develops, and sometimes the external circumstances develop, and sometimes usually they both develop, right? So that's what you have here with the Malbim. That's what you have at the Malbim, where the two interpretations of the Malbim offer two distinct stories as to what changed. Either Isaac is different than Abraham, or the land of Israel in the days of Isaac is different than the land of Israel in the days of Abraham.
Seth, I think you can leave that ajar. Because other kids probably didn't. No, just so it doesn't lock completely.
Closes itself, I can't, in other words, unless you can do that.
It's a- Right. Supposedly they can dress it. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, that's wait.
You should know I corrupted a lot for future reference.
Okay. Okay, another thing we want to think about, a lot more to say on this story, but I'm just going to try to do this quickly because you don't want to sit here all day. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 26. Yeah, no, look, you're on the right page. You're good. But I just turned you back for the other story. Okay, so what does God say? He says, do not, verse 2, and the Lord appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land that I will tell you. Shechon. Page 129 in the Art Scroll, verse 2. How do they translate it? Hashem said to him, do not descend to Egypt, dwell in the land that I shall indicate to you. Okay, so dwell. Both the translations use the word dwell. Problem is, the next verse says a different expression. Sojourn in the land. Gur ba'aretz. So should Isaac dwell in the land, or should Isaac sojourn in the land? Now, what does sojourn mean? I have no idea what sojourn means, but gur, to live. So in modern Hebrew, gur means to live. There really is no other, there's no difference between gur and shechon. Lagur is to live. But in biblical Hebrew, there's a very big difference.
He can dwell in sojourn. He could, I mean, to dwell is to live.
What's more permanent? Dwell.
Dwells more permanent.
Right.
However, when he's not dwelling, he can't be moving around the land.
Oh, so sojourn, I don't know what the English, I'm not an expert in English, but in Hebrew, gur means live, but it's live in a way that's not permanent. The root of gur is ger, foreigner. In other words, a somebody who's not native.
See.
So one second. So shechon means you settle here permanently. Gur means settle here temporarily. That's what the connotation of the word. You don't mean if you want the person to settle, you don't say gur. Modern Hebrew you do, but biblical Hebrew you don't. It's clear that when so clear that lagur means temporary. When Jacob meets Pharaoh, he says, "Oh, we're coming here lagur ba'aretz banu. We came to live here because of the famine." And he uses the term "live" temporarily. They didn't want to get stuck in Egypt for 210 years. So that's the meaning of the word. So we'll take Seth's question in a second. But what you see here is that you have two verses. Verse 2 says, God says shechon, which means settle, which means permanently. And then gur means sojourn in the land. So however we're going to explain it, that's already enough to trigger the commentators and say, what's going on here? Is it shechon, which is dwell permanently, or is it gur, do so temporarily? And again, it's not so much, we're not looking for questions, but what the commentators explain, according to the various commentators, there is a story going on. There's a backstory that we don't see until we realize that Hashem is telling him something with this specific change of expressions. Go ahead, Seth.
Well, he's telling him, you're going to dwell in the land.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you, I'm going to indicate you to where I'm going to be. And so you should start sojourning and I will be with you. So he says, you're going to dwell here.
Yeah.
But first you have to walk around and get used to it. And as you're walking, I'm going to indicate to
Right.
you. Because I'll be
Okay, so
with
that's
you.
so you're saying similar to what Steve said, which is that sojourn means keep moving, right? Sojourn means keep moving. Travel, and then shechon, I'll tell you where to settle. Settle the land that I'll
So
tell you.
first he says, you're going to settle here.
Right,
And then I'm going to tell you where it is while you're going around.
right.
And
right.
I'm going to give you all these things.
Yeah, so I understand why you're saying this. You're saying this probably because that's what the English word sojourn means. But I'm telling you that the word gur doesn't mean travel.
What does it mean?
Gur means to live in a specific place. In modern Hebrew, open up the dictionary, lagur, I ask you, where do you live? I say, efatak gar, where do you live?
Dwell or is gur sojourn?
Gur is sojourn. But so here's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say is that the word gur means live in a temporary place. Don't settle. Live, you're still living here. You're paying rent, you're living here, but you're still a sojourner in the sense that you're a foreigner. You're not laying roots here. That's what the word gur in biblical Hebrew means. Why they translate sojourn, that you'll have to ask the translators. I don't know what sojourn means. I don't know. I should check it out. Go ahead, Zina.
So it doesn't mean renting.
It could be, I don't care if you buy, but it means that are you laying roots? When your neighbors say, "No, what's going on? Where are you from? What are your plans?" So sometimes you move to a place and say, "I'm living here forever. My kids are going to live here. My grandkids are going to live here." Or you could say, "Well, I'm on the go. So on the way here. There's a famine, so I'm coming. I'll be out of here in a week."
But it says, I will indicate to you. So he's saying, as you go along, it doesn't even matter about the word sojourn. It could be the word you're saying,
Yeah.
but he's going to indicate it to.
Yeah. Which land did God indicate? I presume God indicated the land he was in because that's where he stayed.
He's going to give all of these things.
Correct. But where should he actually dwell? Where I will tell
He's
you.
going to indicate.
By the way, Webster says sojourn is a temporary.
Yeah, says Webster is right. That it's just been reported that Webster says sojourn means it's temporary stay. Stay somewhere temporarily. Okay, so now I know why they use the word sojourn. So temporary. So but shechon means settle. So there's something here. There's a story here. So therefore, the commentaries offer different interpretations, which I forgot what they were. No, I'm kidding. I'm only half kidding. I have to check my notes again.
This is complicated.
Yeah, everything's complicated, but there's a backstory. There's a backstory.
Rabbi, what's the difference between the word lagur and lachayot?
Lichyot is to live, but in biblical Hebrew, even in modern Hebrew, in English, I say, where do you live? The word live has the word life in it, right? To say, where do we live? You really mean, where do I pay rent? Where do I pay the mortgage, right? Where do I pay state, whatever, where do I pay property taxes, right? But in Hebrew, there's a separate thing. Your life is not your home. Maybe in America it is, but so you're not going to say, Efa Tachai. Maybe you'll say it, but it's not very common. You're not going to say, where do you live? You're going to say, Efa Tagar, which means, where do you dwell? Where do you dwell? Not where do you live? You live when you study Torah, you're alive. You live when, where do you dwell? Where do you dwell? Means, where do you go at night? Where do you dwell? But even when dwell, there's two different words. In biblical Hebrew, there's a subtlety. And it's important because remember, in English, you lose that subtlety, but in Hebrew, it's very important. You see somebody and the guy says, I live here or I live here. Two different words. I sojourn here or I dwell here. It's like, what are you doing? Are you coming for 5 minutes? Are you coming for good? Are you laying roots here? And the way people will respond to you is different. Sometimes they'll allow you to be here temporarily. They'll be upset if you're trying to be here permanently, et cetera, et cetera. Go ahead, Seth.
And number 3, it says, God said, I will indicate to you from time to time where to establish residence.
Yeah.
But for the time being,
Yeah.
sojourn in this land.
That's not the Ramban. Guru Bar says, yeah, the Ramban.
And then it says, God assured him that he will, of the blessing, and he will get sufficient pasture despite the famine. So there, it's saying from time to time,
Yeah.
maybe he's gonna have multiple.
And he's going to have, they would travel. So basically Seth is saying, when God says, I will show you where to dwell, he doesn't say in the present, he doesn't say dwell here, even though he wants him to dwell here. He says, in general, I will show you where to dwell. He means in general, wherever you need to go, I'll indicate to you where you need to go. So that's the Rambam, that's Nachmanides' beautiful interpretation. But Nachmanides doesn't touch upon the difference and the change between the Shechon, dwell permanently, and Gur, dwell temporarily. So again, it's not like the end of the world question, because in modern English, yeah, you use different phrases to make it more, you can't write the same word twice in 2 sentences because it's too boring, and you violate the rules of usage. And Strunk and White won't be happy. But in Hebrew, it doesn't work that way. In Hebrew, every word is precise. And therefore, if it says shechon and it says gur, there's a reason for the change. Now it's our job to figure out what the reason is. What's the deeper story? Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I was just listening to the conversation and thought maybe Hashem said that Isaac needs to settle permanently in the land of Israel in general, but temporarily during the famine, go to that place in the south, and then I bless you. But because you stay in the land of Israel, I'll bless you, and you're not going to suffer from the famine that much.
Very good. Okay, so what you're saying is that in general, in Israel, Shchein Ba'aretz Hazos, dwell in this land is the land of Israel, and sojourn is in this specific spot. That's good. I haven't seen any commentators write that, but that's a wonderful commentary. God willing, in a few years, maybe 10, 15, 20, when we read it again, hopefully I'll be able to remember it and repeat it. So I'll know that I remembered it. That's very good. That's a good interpretation. So I'm just going to give you one interpretation from the Kli Yakar. Kli Yakar has a whole thing. He says this everywhere he can say it. He says it at multiple places in the Torah. He says the same point. And he says the same point, and I could show you the other places where he says it, but it's not for right now, because we want to do more things today. He says Israel, there's two dimensions of Israel. There's the spirituality of the land of Israel, and there is the material sense of the land of Israel. And he talks about the verses that we mentioned earlier, where God tells him twice. First, he says, you get the land, and he says, walk the land. And the first time he doesn't tell him to walk the land, he says, look at the land. When Abraham first gets there, he says, look at the land. And then he says, walk the land. He says it's two different things. When Abraham first gets there and he looks, he's looking at the spirituality of the land. He's acquiring the spirituality of the land. When you walk the land, you acquire the physical ownership. So in other words, whenever you think about Israel, you have to think about it as two-dimensional. There's taking possession of the physical land, then there's the spirituality of Israel. Sometimes they come together. Sometimes you have one and you don't have the other, right? Sometimes you can have the holiness of Israel and not be in Israel. Sometimes you could be in Israel, but you're in tune with the falafel and not with the spirituality. That's the Kli Yakar's big idea. And therefore, he says, when it says settle, and he says sojourn, means what dimension of Israel are we talking about? We're talking about the spirituality of Israel, the holiness of Israel. Here you're dwelling. Here you're permanent. You're really saying, this is who I am. This is where I'm going to be. When it comes to the physical land of Israel, it wasn't yet time for the Jews to dwell there permanently. God still said that you're going to be foreigners in a foreign land for 400 years, and only then will you come back to Israel. If you do the math, the 400 years, the clock starts ticking for the 400 years till the Jews come back after Egypt. The Jews were not in Egypt for 400 years. Remember, there was already the covenant between the parts. God already told Abraham, your descendants will be foreigners for 400 years, and then they'll come back. But they were only in Egypt for 210 years, and they were only slaves in Egypt for 86 years. So didn't God say 400 years? So there are all kinds of interpretations. But one interpretation is, when he says your descendants will be foreigners for 400 years, your descendants means from the birth of your descendants. From the birth of Isaac, the clock starts ticking. And therefore, the patriarchs never dwell in the land of Israel in a permanent way. Because if they would, that would stop the clock ticking for 400 years, where you'll be foreigners. So in other words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob themselves, even when they lived in Egypt, even when they lived in Israel, they did not live in a permanent way. And that's why you look at their life stories, you see that, ironically, when they were outside of Israel, they had an easier time than when they were in Israel. Because in Israel, if you're permanent in Israel, in the physical part of Israel, then you're not a foreigner, and we have to be foreigners. We have to wait 400 years. Why that is another story. That's the Kli Yakar's big idea. He says it's all over the place. So now the way he applies it to these verses, he says, take possession, dwell in the holiness of the land of Israel. You're permanent in the sense that this is your space. This is where your spiritual life is. But your physical existence, that's still temporary. You're not really taking possession here for the long term, because the time has not yet come. And that's why both things could be true. You can dwell and you could be a sojourner. You could live here permanently and temporarily together, because we're talking about, what are we talking about? Talking about your spiritual side. You're settling in the spiritual, the holiness of the land of Israel. Yes, you're saying, this is me. I'm not going anywhere. I'm connected to this space. I'm connected to the story of this land. Physically, I'm not really living here permanently. So I'm only saying this because you have these two dimensions of living, both physical and spiritual. Okay. I now want to go to a broader point from Nachmanides, and this is going to apply to this page and to next page. This is a very important point. One of the problems that the sages are interested in is, what is the purpose of the book of Genesis? I mean, it's a wonderful storybook. You can keep people busy for a long time. People are much more interested in coming to show in the weeks of the Genesis, because the stories, as opposed to the books of Leviticus, which is just laws and it's boring. But if you ask the question, the Torah is a book of law. Torah is lessons, law. What is the purpose of the book of Genesis? It's just stories. It's not a storybook. We're not history. You want history, go buy a history book. Torah is not a history book. It's a lesson book. So one answer is, well, there are a lot of lessons that could be derived from the patriarchs. In fact, you learn more from the way people live their life than from the books. So in some sense, the greater lesson is in the book of Genesis. That is one wonderful interpretation. Nachmanides has a unique perspective on the book of Genesis, especially the stories of the patriarchs. He says that everything that happens to the patriarchs is really destined to happen to their descendants as well. And therefore, why is it important for the Jewish people to know what happens in the stories of patriarchs? Because history repeats itself, and whatever happens to the parents happens to the children. That's what he says. And you'll see that he talks about that in the next page. Just as simple as Abraham, just as simple as this. I tell you the words of Abraham. There was a famine, and Abraham was forced to go to Egypt. Okay, just those words. Change the names. Later on, there was a famine, and the Jewish people ended up in Egypt. And then what happened in Abraham's story? The Pharaoh was afflicted, and then he sent the Jews, and the Jews left, and sent out Abraham and Sarah, and they left with tremendous amount of possessions. Okay, that's exactly what happened later, right? Pharaoh was struck with the 10 plagues, and then the Jews left with great possessions. So that's just a pattern that repeats itself. But he says it's not just the grandchildren, but it's the Jewish people as a whole. Go ahead.
This is where the introduction of Shem comes, because,
Okay,
but
go back to us.
this
Yeah.
is where Hashem and the belief
Yeah.
in Hashem comes from. And afterwards, they lost belief, and then they went back to this way.
You learn by trial and error,
And they
unfortunately.
realized,
Yeah.
but they realized that, it's like the father's rich. That's why I drive a Lexus.
Right. So you
The
learn from the
father
father's
did
experience.
all the-
Right,
in a lot of things.
right. Okay, so let's think about this for a second in this context. I want to even open up the Nachmanides to make sure I don't miss any beautiful nuance. It says Nachmanides like this: if I tell you there was a story, what does Nachmanides say?
This is where the miracles happen
Yeah,
in Genesis. This is where the miracles are demonstrated.
right.
Right.
Oh, so this is beautiful. Nachmanides says like this. He says like this. Okay, so if you're going to tell me that the pattern of what happens to the patriarchs is really foretelling of what's going to happen to the children, says Nachmanides, that's why. So what happened to the children? So we have different exiles. There are various exiles. There are four. We end up with four exiles. There's the exile of Egypt, and then years and years later, there's the exile after the destruction of the first temple. We're exiled to Babylonia. After we're exiled to Babylonia, we come back, we rebuild the second temple, and then we call the exile of Greece. It's not really an exile, but it's really an invasion. The Greeks invade, and they take over rule. That we lose our sovereignty. So that's considered a third exile, and the fourth exile is considered once the Romans come and destroy the second temple. It's called the Roman exile, and which becomes the European and etc. But it's all in this words of the sages, it's all the fourth exile, the exile of Rome, because according to the tradition, there's only four exiles. Okay. So what was the first exile? Egypt. That was the story of Abraham. Abraham goes down to Egypt, and that's foretelling what's going to happen when the Jewish people enter Egypt. Okay, that's the first story. What's the second story? The second story is what happens to Isaac has to foretell the second exile, which is the Jewish people going to Babylonia. Almost 1,000 years later. Now, you want to know, the big question is, why does Abraham go to Egypt and Isaac goes to Gerar? Don't say what's the difference. The difference is because it's foretelling of a different story. What happens with the story when the Jewish people go to Babylonia? So Babylonia is not Philistine. Philistine is in Israel, which is literally in the borders of Israel. But Babylonia is distant. So Nachmanides now is going to explain how Isaac going to Gerar, and this entire story that we're about to read is similar to what's going to happen to the Jewish people in the exile of Babylonia in Iraq. So I'm going to just try to read Nachmanides here a little bit so I don't miss anything. So he says like this. He says, when Isaac went because of the famine, and he goes to exile against his will, he's forced because of the famine. He says that is a different exile. That's similar to the exile of Babylonia. Now, Gerar, where Isaac goes to, is still in Israel. So essentially, he's going to exile to the land of his fathers, because the entire land, including Gerar, was promised to his ancestor, to Abraham. So he's going to exile to the land of his father. So it's sort of an exile, but you're in exile, but it's still your space. Says that Nachmanides, I would never think of this. They go to Babylonia, but Babylonia is the land of their ancestors. How so? Because where did Abraham start out? Abraham started out in Babel. So when the Jewish people are exiled to Babylonia, they're really going, in a sense, they're going home. And unlike when they were exiled to Rome, Abraham was never in Rome. He's an Iraqi, right? So the point here is that Nachmanides says that's the point that when they're going to that Isaac going to Gerar is foretelling the story of the Jewish people going to go to later to to Babylonia, which is the land of their ancestors. Now, he says, let's look at the stories. When Isaac goes to Gerar, nothing bad happens to him. His wife wasn't taken away, but it's just that he was not in his native place, and he was afraid. He was afraid they would, but nothing bad happened. And the reality is that the king actually, when he found out that Rebekah was Abraham's wife, not only didn't take her away the way Pharaoh did, but he actually protected them. And he proclaimed and he said, we'll see in a minute, but let's just get to the story. He says, as we're going to see, he says, anyone who touches this man will die. Later, he sends him off with a covenant. Why? Because so presumably he's a better person. He's a more moral person. Says Nachmanides, that's exactly what happened with Babylonia. When the Jews were exiled to Babylonia, it wasn't like, I'm adding this, it wasn't like when they were exiled to Rome, where they were tortured and they were sold as slaves. No, when the Jewish people were exiled to Babylonia, they were not tortured. In fact, the leaders of the Jews became ministers in the kingdom of Babylonia. And after the exile of Babylonia, it becomes Persia, but they send the Jewish people back to build the temple, and they give them permission to build the temple, and they make a covenant. So this is sort of a funny exile, the exile of Babylonia. They were sent away, but it wasn't in a way that they were actually tortured or actually harmed. In fact, they were honored in Babylonia. And then after a while, they were sent back to Israel, and they actually made a covenant, because with the Persian kings, which is the descent, which was the continuation of the Babylonian kings, they sent the Jewish people back, or allowed them to go back and rebuild the second temple. Says Nachmanides, that is exactly what's happening in the story of Isaac. He goes to exile, but he goes to exile in the land that was in the borders of the land promised to his father. So he was going to exile to his father's land, just like Babylonia was the land of Abraham. And what happens there? He's given great honor. He's in a state of exile because he's in fear, but he's given honor. They make a covenant, and eventually he's sent back. So now going back to our original question, why does God intervene and tell Isaac stay here? And Abraham goes to Egypt because, again, Nachmanides' view is whatever God does to the patriarchs is to teach what he's going to do to the children. And therefore, Isaac is different because Isaac is here to represent a different exile. So I think it's interesting because you're looking at the Torah, the book of Genesis, as foretelling all of Jewish history, and you will see that Nachmanides does this consistently throughout the book, including next page. So I thought that was interesting. Okay.
Rabbi, would you consider that as a remez, whether the interpretation that I gave was more like a pshat level?
That's a good question. Is it simple? Is this a simple meaning, or is this something that alludes? Well, that's not such an easy question to answer, because it's not such an easy question to answer because we say
It to the facts also.
No, I'll tell you what I mean. It's not an easy question to answer, because when you say pshat, Seth wanted to know earlier, we discussed what's pshat. Pshat is the straightforward meaning of the verse. So what's the straightforward meaning of the verse? And what is just hinted and alluded to in the verse? So it's not an easy distinction to make, because there's a whole spectrum of pshat. So the whole spectrum of pshat to what is the simple meaning of the verse. And therefore, defining what is the simple meaning of the verse is not so simple. Not so simple to define what's simple. Why not? Because it all depends what you think the Torah assumes we already know. Depending on that, the simple meaning of the verse changes. For example, okay, somebody comes home, there's a knock on the door, and the door opens, and a guest is standing in the door. So father tells the son, "We have a guest." That's a statement. Now the question is, what's pshat? What is the meaning of that statement? It's just informational? Or is the father telling his son, we have a guest, do what we usually do when we have a guest, invite them in, take off the coat, give him some tea, give him chicken soup, give him a place to sleep. What does it mean? We have a guest. What does it mean? It all depends what the child already knows and what the assumption of the father is that the child knows. If usually what we do to a guest is we just give him tea, and the father wants the kid to find him a place to sleep, so then he'll say, we have a guest. Could you find a place to sleep? If usually we also, that's included in we have a guest, so the father doesn't have to say find him a place to sleep. So the point here is, what is pshat? It's that not so easy to determine what the reader already knows, and therefore it's obvious in the verse, even though it doesn't say it. It doesn't say the father didn't tell the kid there's a guest, give him a cup of tea. It doesn't have to say it. That's the assumed. So the question is, what's the assumed? So I would say, if you're Nachmanides, you believe that the whole purpose of Genesis is to tell you what's going to happen in the future. So that's understood. If that's understood, maybe that's pshat. Maybe not. I don't know. I can't say for sure. But I'm just saying it all depends on what the presumed knowledge is even before the verses started talking. But if we assume that everybody knows when the Torah itself is starting to talk, the Torah understands that I talked to you about the patriarchs. I'm really not interested. It's not, if it would be just for the patriarchs, I wouldn't put it in the Torah. I would leave it in the Medrash. Not everything in the Torah, not everything that happened to the patriarchs is in the Torah. You want the history? Go read the Medrash. Go read the oral tradition. But if it's in the Torah, according to Nachmanides, it's telling you something about the future. And therefore, that's pshat. Others would say, no, that's not the premise of the book. It's not the purpose of the book. So it's not pshat, it's remes. It all depends what you think the kid knows. That's what I would say. So the short answer is it the simple meaning of the verse? It's not so simple. So I don't know. Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, Rabbi. So it means that pshat has different levels too, right?
Yeah, pshat, depending on what is pshat for a 5-year-old, is pshat right. for an advanced student. There's the simple meaning of the text. You show two people any text, Shakespeare, any text, and say, what's the simple meaning? It depends. It depends what the reader already knows. It depends. There's no simple answer. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Good morning, Rabbi. Does Nachmanides weigh in on the fact that Isaac is a well digger? I mean, does this have any significance for the future? Are we talking about the 21st century? What are we doing?
When we talk about the wells, Nachmanides is going to mention the wells. He's going to talk about the 3 wells correspond to the 3 temples. We already had 2 and the 3rd one. So again, Nachmanides is consistent. So I didn't read him recently. So hopefully next time we meet, we'll get to the 3 wells and we'll read him carefully. But what I do remember is the 3 wells is a metaphor for the 3 temples. And what happens to the 3 wells, the tension that the first 2 have, and there's a different type of tension. What happens to the 3 wells is foretelling what's going to happen to the 3 temples. So far we had 2, the 3rd one is yet to be. But in other words, yes, Nachmanides is very consistent, is you have to look at the details of the stories because they're indicative of what happens later. Now, we don't always know, but certain things we have hindsight for, like the first 2 temples were destroyed. And the first 2 wells, spoiler alert, if you don't want to ruin it for next week, turn off close your ears. But the first 2 wells were stuffed by the Philistines. That's a metaphor for the first 2 temples who were later destroyed. But that's Nachmanides' consistent view. Other people say, no, what are you talking about? That's not what the verses are saying. But the Nachmanides is consistent throughout the book of Genesis. Something to look forward to. Yes. You always have to have a cliffhanger. Yes. Go ahead, Seth.
I agree with it's going to show what's going to happen. But would you really say that the purpose of this in the beginning is to say how God, I don't think like the walking the land, anything when it's secular is really the important part. The important part is that God always helped us, God always was with us.
Yes.
Abraham had to believe in it, and we have to learn to believe in it. And when we don't believe in it, we're going to have these bad things happen.
I agree, but I think that just like the patriarchs have different scenarios unfold, Jewish history has these different scenarios unfold. There's 3 exiles, there's a 4th, but I'm just saying each exile is different trials and tribulations. So if there was only one model, we know how to survive in exile like Egypt, where there's oppression. But do we know how to survive in exile, or could we survive in exile with Babylonia, where they're not trying to oppress us? To the contrary, they're giving us honor and they want us to assimilate.
That's because
so one second. But if you didn't have that story, imagine there's only one story in Genesis. The Jews were oppressed and they survived. Now, when we come to an exile like Babylonia, or like Spain, or like America, where there's no external oppression. So for us sitting here, we say, we don't have any precedent for the Jewish people being able to survive, God helping us, even though there's no physical oppression. Maybe God doesn't intervene. Maybe God only intervenes when there is physical oppression. Maybe God doesn't save us when the challenge to our identity is less obvious. But now that we read through the book of Genesis, and we had all kinds of stories, and we have some stories where we're being oppressed, and some stories where, to the contrary, we're being honored. And yet, in all those scenarios, God protects us. So now we have a spectrum of stories and a spectrum of experiences that the patriarchs experienced. Now we, for the next 3,000 years, when we go through various experiences, we get Seth's point, which is wherever we will be, if we're loyal to God, God will protect us. But we have that we have the benefit of seeing the spectrum of experiences. It's not one-dimensional story. It's not, they tried to kill us, God saved us, we eat. It's much more complicated than that. There are different exiles, there are different experiences. And Nachmanides' big idea is we're not just here to tell a story about the life of Abraham versus the life of Isaac. We're saying there are different experiences where God is going to come and do something different for you, because what's necessary is different, because the challenge is different. And we, the children, why is it written in the Torah? Because God wants to give us the benefit of knowing these stories so that we can apply it to our life as well. Yeah, that's Nachmanides' big idea. Nachmanides' big idea that when we read the Torah, it's based on a phrase from the Medrash, which is Ma'aseh Avos Simon Labanim. The actions of the fathers is a sign for the children. So the Medrash says it once, but Nachmanides says that's the big idea of the whole book. The whole Genesis is here to tell us throughout all of Jewish history, throughout all of Jewish history to teach us that whatever happened to the patriarchs, we should learn from that, because history repeats itself.
So then God gave us the halacha in the second chapter.
Yeah.
So he even gave us
The
more
law,
guidance
but that
and made it easier for us, and we still didn't do it.
correct. But that's part of the story. Part of the story is that we know that we don't always do it, and we know that we're exiled, and we know that God is going to save us. So that's all. It's all in the story. It's all in the story. Remember, yeah, we could talk about it next time. No, it's not confusing. This is part of the big idea. The big idea is the big threat. I don't want to talk about it right now because it's already 10:32 and I have to run and teach the kids. But the big threat connected to the parsha of the week, last week, this week, next week, Moshe keeps saying, we're going to sin, we're going to be punished, and you should know that. And you should know God will bring you back to Israel. Why is it so important to elaborate on the rebuke? Why is it so important to elaborate on every type of calamity that will befall us, like we had yesterday's parsha? That's ridiculous. So why are you saying this? So I think it's quite obvious that the big idea is as follows. Moshe wants to make sure that the Jewish people, no matter what happens, they understand they're still part of the story. In other words, if you understand that this has been predicted, which means God did not abandon you. This is part of the plan. So it's part of the plan. It's not comfortable. It's not happy, but we know that this is part of the story. This is not an abandonment. And Moshe is more afraid of anything, is afraid of the Jewish people interpreting the exile, interpreting the persecution as if the Jewish people interpret that to mean God abandoned us. So he doesn't want to do that. What he wants to say is, no, what's happening to you, of course it's terrible, but this is exactly what God predicted. So understand that we're just in the middle of the story. We have to turn the page, go to the next chapter, and we repent and we come back to Israel. But it's important to lay out the severity of the exile so that people understand we have not been abandoned, because that's what everyone has been telling us for about 2,000 years, that the fact that we're in exile means God abandoned us, and therefore we should buy into the new religion, be it Christianity, be it Islam, doesn't matter what you want, whoever was trying to sell what they were trying to sell. And we said no. We said God didn't abandon us. What do you mean? You're being oppressed. You're being slaughtered. But we know that's in the book. That's in the story. So in other words, once it's in the story, it means that we know how to operate. We know we're still in the story, not out of the story. We know it's still part of the plan. And we know there's still destiny.
So is that why Hitler came and did what he did?
This is beyond my scope. But if you're going to say, does Jewish oppression mean that God abandoned us? Moshe is screaming for yesterday's parsha, this parsha, and next week's parsha. That's all his point. And the next week. Well, his only point is, don't worry, when you get oppressed, it's not that God abandoned you. That's his only message. That's what you read yesterday's parsha. Yesterday's parsha is pretty scary. So again, the point is not to say that the point is to say we can't misinterpret the exile for abandonment. And I think that's what Nachmanides is saying. Nachmanides is saying is that yes, when we're going to find ourselves in this type of exile, or that type of exile, it's all in the story. We have precedent. We know how this will unfold.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, in part, he said, he'll turn it back, but there's no indication.
Hide his face.
Permanent.
Yeah, and there's also and later Moshe reclassifies that as hiding of the face. And hiding means he's hiding. Hiding doesn't mean he's not present. To the contrary, you can only hide if you're here. If you're not here, you're not hiding. You're absent. It doesn't say God is absent. It says God hides his face.
That wasn't scary, I'll tell you,
That was a scary parsha, but it's almost as scary. But it's not. But Jewish history is also scary. That's the point
I
here.
couldn't even read it.
Well, if you pick up a book of Jewish history, you can't read it either, right? So that's the whole point here. That's what Moshe is trying to do. He's trying to say, he's trying to tell you that when something terrible happens, you don't say, "Oh, this is I don't know how." It must be God abandoned us. Okay, so I'm saying Nachmanides is doing the same thing. Okay, a lot more to say. God willing, next week and good health. Next week is Erev Rosh Hashanah. We'll have to see. If we'll do a class. We'll send an email, hopefully by Thursday, Friday, and if not next week, then the following week.
So it'll be on Sunday.
Yeah, next Sunday is just a busy Sunday, so we'll see. Maybe we'll see. We'll see what happens.
We have services.
Yes, it's a long service. We have to do a Taras and Darim. We have to nullify the vows. Okay. In any case, I don't see you. If we do see you, if I don't see you. Shana Tova, sweet, happy new year. Only good news, only blessing in the coming year. Thank you all for joining.
Shana Tova, Rabbi,
Shana Tova.
and Yasha Koach.
Thank you.